Therapists of Reddit, what was your biggest "I know I'm not supposed to judge you but holy shit *t moment? U/Hi-Popper responded. I was counseling a 13-year-old girl for anxiety and she reported sexual abuse from her stepdad. I called her mom and told her mother I needed to call Child Protective Services. Turns out that CPS was already aware and the abuse was first report around the patient's age 7. Mom was aware of the abuse and stayed with her husband anyway. It was a complicated situation, and it wasn't. How could she not do more to protect her daughter? Sorry lady. I'm judging. U/hollow_comment 669 responded. I work at a residential group home. We had a kid who we had admitted about 4 months prior, when in a family session they mentioned they had parasites. I'm like, what? Mom goes, oh yeah, our whole family has them. We don't believe in getting rid of them since they're part of our biological ecosystem, and I'm just dumbstruck. We spent 3 weeks afterwards convincing this family it was an infectious disease concerns as other residents have fecal eating behaviors and various other unsanitary issues that could cause a unit spread. 3 weeks of education, planning, and worst of all convincing this kid and mother that their IQ wouldn't drop because they had agreed to irradiate the parasite. Lots of CBT work, but Jesus, it took way longer than any of my team expected. U/PrimeGuard responded. Once had a patient whose wife shook their baby to death. He wanted help reconnecting with his wife. At the time I was a young father of a newborn myself, and he triggered a lot of fear in me for my own child, a deep loathing of his spouse, and pity, the how pathetic kind, for the patient. I tried for 3 sessions, met his spouse and everything before handing the case over to my supervisor, who knew about my initial reactions, and tried to help me through it. Unfortunately, it ended up being more about my feelings than his, and I was new to the profession at the time. These things are expected to crop up from time to time, but I was still taken aback by my own reactions. U/Armglukahale responded. I work with kiddos who have experienced some kind of abuse trauma. 90% of my clients have been sexually abused. I have a lot of holy shit moments, but not from judgment of my clients but from what happened to them. I've had clients whose father made them help him dismember mom's body after dad murdered her in front of them. I've had clients under the age of 8 who have been sex trafficked. I've had clients who have been forced to film torture porn. I have holy shit moments all the time. U/Merlin560 responded. I was once in my psychiatrist's office a bi-monthly, 15 minutes med check. She asked me what was going on more as conversation. I told her that in the last 6 weeks, my 3 elders, aunt and 2 uncles, I was guardian conservator for had died one right after the other. My wife had a heart attack. My daughter attempted suicide. And my mom broke her hip and had laid on her floor for a week before being found. She drank and ate from the dog's bowls. I got that call within 10 minutes of setting up the last funeral. She stopped the meeting, got on the phone with a therapist in the office next to her and had her postpone her next meeting to speak with me. I was so fucked up, I had no idea. I think she saved my life. U/A_bird_speed responded. It's not often I get to talk about my profession, but here goes. I was working at a drug and alcohol rehabilitation center and had a client come in who was a self-proclaimed drug lord. As we worked together, he told me about his history. Included in this history was how he got to where he was currently at. During the conversation, this man admitted to selling his sister into sex slavery, forcibly injecting her with several sedatives and narcotics, and having several people teach her a lesson. What this meant, he never shared. He told this story with a blank face, smiling only when he recalled the good times, which he referred to as times when he had enough heroin to get through the day. I'm not sure where he is at now, but this man inspired me to work with victims of sex trafficking, because not only do they deal with the stigma of selling their bodies, they often manage drug addictions. People would honestly be floored if they realized how many people were addicted to chemicals that they were forcibly given. U/SecondGuard responded. I feel like a lot of the comments saying that they never judge their clients might be working in voluntary services or they've been very fortunate in their client base. Judgment isn't an inherently bad thing. It's how we know that murdering people is wrong. So when a convicted pedophile client told me, nothing gets me going like a pair of little girls' worn panties, you better believe I judged the fuck out of him. I continued to work with him and I treated him with compassion and respect because he's a human being worthy of both. I did my job because I'm a professional. But I can't honestly say that I didn't judge him. I judged that he should never be around children. I judged that he is not yet ready for change. I judged that his access to his own daughter should be closely supervised. That's a lot of judgments. Understanding your own inherent biases and how they influence your work is a very important part of training and practice. My fiancé made me join responded. Lots of people discussing pedophilia as an example of the toughest stuff to not judge despite our training. I haven't yet treated a pedophile, thankfully. At least not an identified one. I did run a men's anger management group though, and some of those men had done some terrible things to women. Most of them I found ways to like and admire for their positive aspects, but there were 2 guys in that group I just could never find unconditional positive regard for. One guy basically never spoke in group. He would give one-word answers and occasionally just discuss how unfair the system was to him. I worked really hard to open him up and find things to connect over, but he never opened up to me or the group. He left the group after he strangled his girlfriend and went to jail. She survived, thankfully. The other left group early routinely, showed up late, participated minimally, and similarly never wanted to open up honestly. He left early one group after we had discussed him staying to the end and threatened me when I told him he wasn't going to get credit for attendance, something the court required. Oddly, I eventually moved into the apartment below him, completely without knowledge, and listened to him scream at his girlfriend and break shit while I called the cops. I judge these men. They're shitty. Maybe they're redeemable, but redemption requires self-exploration and they both refuse to do so. It's worth noting how differently I felt about them than so many others in the group, men I found ways to help and admire and respect even in spite of their awful behavior in the past. Bobomberman responded. I joined in a review of a secluded patient and he threw a cup of wee and poo in my face when we opened the door. I tried to be objective about his experience, but I just thought, what a cunt. I work in inpatient services, so it can be hard to challenge myself at times. Individuals with diagnosis of personality disorder, for example, can do things that in isolation make you think they're just being bratty or manipulative, but to think of the experiences that shaped them to react like that in a given situation can help to clear my judgment and find compassion. Harder when someone bites me or hits me with one of our fabulously detachable anti-ligature curtain poles, though. Shozo_Nishi responded. I work with youth and adolescents who have anxiety, trauma, and/or depression. Some of the kids I worked with had some pretty severe attachment issues. Regardless of this, I never thought LD have to seriously explain. 1. You can't just buy a straitjacket for your kid. 2. Feeding your kid ultra-spicy ramen each night instead of the meal everyone else is eating isn't specifically defined as abuse, but you have to understand the emotional abuse that this causes. 3. Your kid isn't trying to kill you because they stand in your doorway at night crying. That's likely because they're scared of their traumatic nightmares, but feel like you will just yell at them if they wake you up. Edit. Removed a phrase. Edit 2. Thank you all for your questions and support. This case has really helped to shape my approach to therapy, and has highlighted the importance of healthy communication between parents and kids. My number 1 tip, don't let someone else tell you how you think. If someone says, "You're angry with me," or something to that effect, ask yourself if you really are. If you're not actually angry, then don't spend a second more on it. A lot of kids' family members get hung up on trying to justify their own actions according to someone else's perception. Mufabulous responded. Therapist here. I don't think LVE ever judged clients. My job is to understand them and their experiences and help them make the improvements they are ready to make. But I have very directly made my thoughts clear about choices, especially choices parents make about their kids. This probably comes off as judgment depending on the client's insecurity about the topic. One example was telling parents of a child I was working with a severe mood disorder that had made both suicidal and homicidal threats and attempts, that it did not seem like a good idea to buy the young kid a gun, especially the week after the mother spent the session sharing her fears that the child would murder her. Frictional Tales responded. Clinical psychologist working primarily in forensics here. This means my clients are usually involved in legal proceedings, family court, juvenile court, criminal court, etc. My job is usually to evaluate or provide treatment. I'm not there to judge, that's the judge's job, but of course I have my thoughts. I am usually impressed by the justifications people make for shitty behavior. The one that irks me the most is when parents manipulate their child against the other parent. LVE had to do therapy for a 5-year-old who said she doesn't want to see a parent because they haven't paid child support. Excuse me? What 5-year-old knows, understand, or needs to be worried about child support? Rinkaninja girl responded. Opposite side, if that's accepted too. I was assigned to see the lead psychologist of the local hospital as I was severely depressed and had become suicidal. She literally rolled her eyes at me, told me to grow up and said she could be having appointments with people who were actually about to kill themselves, not me who was already working with the team. This sent me absolutely spinning, bottling everything up, thinking I didn't deserve help, and ended up in hospital 2 years later after an attempt. When they looked at my records, the hospital suddenly became very interested in any psychological experts LD previously spoken to, informed them of the above incident. They asked if I knew the name and I said I didn't, but they had a strong accent. They immediately looked like they were about to burst out crying, apologized excessively, then informed me they had been fired a year ago. No idea how many people were affected by that therapist. You/miscellaneac responded. OP, you mentioned you're getting ready to start therapy. I know we're different, but therapy was one of the best decisions I ever made for myself. It's good to have a neutral third party weigh in on what troubles you. And remember, you don't have to stay with a therapist if you don't want. Therapy, like any psychological treatment, is often more about trial and error to find what works for the individual than anything. Also, you'll get out of it what you put in, so be upfront, frank, and honest with your therapist. That will help them work with you on determining the best therapy course for you. I wish you the best of luck. You/Susina responded. When you as a therapist get to that point, it's time to start thinking of referrals. Be genuine with your client. And then refer out. You have to have unconditional positive regard or you'll never achieve therapeutic rapport. I think for me, the one that comes to mind is a frequent caller to the suicide hotlines. He'd call in and say he's not providing his phone number or name. He would just say that you had 10 seconds to convince him not to kill himself over the phone, or he'd blow his brains out and it'd be your fault. Then he'd count down from 10 to 1 while you're on the phone talking. At 1, he'd hang up. I'm sure the whole point was to make me feel bad or prove some point. I don't know, I have insufficient information to make an assessment with just that. But I have to admit, when I was trying to sleep on days he'd call, especially the first time, I was thinking, fucking asshole better not be dead, fucker. You/Vulcan Humor responded. When I was a teenager, I lived in a very emotionally and mentally abusive household. I know people don't take that stuff seriously, but it was so bad that I was later diagnosed with PTSD from a psychiatrist. Anywho, my abusive parents and I got in a verbal fight in the car. My stepdad stopped the car and told me, "Get out, we're leaving you on the highway." I wasn't scared because I knew I could just call the police, say I was an abandoned child, and they'd get in loads of trouble, so I said sounds good and got out. My mom then came out and started attacking me. I refused to get back in the car after the attack, so my stepdad got out, dragged me by the hair, called me a bipolar bitch, and threw me in. They made me see a therapist. They told her that I jumped out of a moving car and then I attacked my mom when she was trying to help. This therapist didn't believe anything I said and tried getting me to take bipolar meds. I knew I wasn't bipolar, I was being abused, and I knew that the anger and sadness I felt was normal for my situation. She glared at me and said, "You're not nearly as smart as you think you are." I refused to say a word in any of our therapy sessions after that. I would just go in, sit down, and she'd make snarky, sarcastic remarks for a few minutes then dismiss me. She wasn't trying to help me, she was trying to help my parents. I moved out when I was 18, went to college all on my own with no financial help from my family, got a job and left the country to be as far from them as possible. I'm on antidepressants for my PTSD, and luckily the therapists I've had since my teenage years have been nothing like that horrible woman, but it still upsets me deeply thinking about it. You/Hideyoshi_Toyotomi responded. Not a licensed therapist but a behavioral health technician, basically, means I got a psych degree. I was trained in behavioral intervention techniques for children and was off helping coach parents to support children with behavior disorders. I'll say this, I rarely encountered a child that had a clear mental illness in the same way as when I worked with adults with serious mental illness. In many ways, they were visibly confused or lonely. Given that most of their parents were suffering from poverty, alleviating the burdens of being poor would have likely mitigated the most severe symptoms of many of the children. Advocating for affordable childcare and livable minimum wages is mental health advocacy. I found myself judging, not the children, but their parents. Some parents would drop the kids off with me and peace out with a fix my kid attitude. As a parent, now, I get some of it. Exhaustion and burnout are real. But the best I could do in that situation was provide that kid with an hour-long vision of what it looks like to live in a loving, structured environment. Those kids were the ones I could tell who were much more likely to be subject to the system for the duration of their lives. Either cycles of institutionalization and homelessness or prison. When a concerned parent showed up and asked, "How do I help my kid?" I practically jumped for joy for the child because they had someone who loved them and was fighting for them. You/Dirty Bertie responded. Therapist here. To piggyback on what others have said, It is highly unlikely for me to have moments where I judge my clients. It happens sometimes, but I'm able to shut down those thoughts quickly in my head and return to being present for the people I see. People are so incredibly complex that my judgment wouldn't have any meaning anyway, and it doesn't have a place in our work together. I will admit though, something that does get me feeling a little salty is when I have a client's parent that attempts to sabotage the therapeutic relationship I have with their child, or pulling them out of therapy entirely when some of the things we talk about challenges some potentially unhealthy family dynamics. I don't feel anger toward the parents, mostly I feel bad for the kid. Edit. Wow. All I have to say is that I am incredibly humbled by all of you that have shared your stories. Even though these moments are so steeped in pain, what hits me is the incredible amount of strength present in spite of the upbringing and parents many of you have had. You/Danidu247 responded. Patient side here. I had been seeing a therapist for a few months to help with chronic depression and self-harm with some pretty intense suicidal ideation. I had tried Suprax in the past, didn't like the side effects and put it down, but I was ready to try something new to supplement therapy. Everyone within earshot was calling Wellbutrin a miracle and lifesaver, so I figured I'd give it a shot. Since my therapist couldn't prescribe drugs, I got an appointment with a psychiatrist. My first appointment, I explain what LVE got going on, what I'm doing to work on it, and what I'm looking for in seeing him. I do a pretty good job holding myself together in public. I dress myself, I hold down jobs. At that point I lived on my own, now living with my partner. All in all, LVE got a well-polished mask. I guess it's too good, because pretty early in our session he looked at me and said, "I don't think you're depressed. Bro. This is the first time we met, LVE been here for 20 minutes, and you're ready to reverse my diagnosis? Cool bro." You/NamelessBob123 responded. During my training I was asked how would you feel if a client were to come to you and admitted they were a pedophile that was on the edge of committing seriously horrific acts? Could you see that person as another human being that needed help, or were your personal feelings about the abhorrent behavior too strong? This factor leads some people to not continue my course on to the next level, but it really illustrates the level of non-judgment needed in this field. We all have our own personal feelings, of course, but these get talked about in supervision. Edit. Wow, thanks for the awards. I'm glad it's raised an interesting topic for discussion. I'm enjoying reading them all, even if I don't have the time to reply. Personally, in this instance I remember the Gandhi quote, "Hate the sin, not the sinner." Also spelling. You/Anon_777 responded. I'm a dude. I was brutally raped multiple times between the ages of 7 and 10. My one and only attempt at try to get help from a therapist was one of the most awful experiences of my life. I attempted to get help in my early 20s. Upon first going in, I was asked what had happened to me, after explaining a basic outline of the abuse. I could already see that she was very dismissive and seemed not to really believe me. She then asked about my relationship status. At the time I was in a long-term relationship with a woman who had 2 kids, boys. Upon finding this out, she immediately demanded the names and address of my girlfriend, names of the kids, and said she would be immediately getting in touch with social services to ensure that I wasn't abusing them. Elle can't put into words just how much that destroyed me mentally, that she could obviously see something in me that I couldn't see, that somehow she was certain that I would be an abuser. I started to cry. She told me to pull myself together. I also can't put into words the pathological visceral hatred I have for pedophiles and rapists. If I could get away with murdering them I would. I would never ever inflict the absolute nightmare I went through on any child. I got up and left. I came very close to the edge of suicide that day. I also immediately ended the relationship because I couldn't deal with the thought that the kids might be at risk because of me. It's now 21 years later and I'm tearing up typing this. Because of that experience I have never sought therapist help again. I survive mentally, but it's not good survival. You/deleted responded. Not a judgment, you kind of train your brain not to judge, because you are seeking to understand and help. When you do those things, you can't simultaneously judge. We could all use a little more of that in real life, I suppose. I'll share this though. I do feel concerned about this recent phenomenon of young people I worked with self-diagnosing, sharing, and identifying very closely with mental illness, as if the pendulum quickly swung from never, ever share your feelings to OMG, you're depressed? All of us are too. Life's challenges can be tough and they don't need a scientific-sounding label to be valid and real. You are not your diagnosis. We can find validation and support in healthier ways. Edit. Thank you for the golden awards. And thanks to everyone for some really nice discussion. You/my_cats_Reddit responded. Two contexts come to mind. I often work with people in abusive relationships, and it is incredibly common for people to go back to their abusive partners after leaving. Some studies show the average number of times someone goes back before leaving for good is 7 times. I know why people go back, and I get that it's often a combination of manipulation, financial control, gaslighting, love, low self-esteem, fear, etc. But, man, it is hard to watch and appear neutral. I can say I am worried about their safety, but I can't yell, "For fuck's sake, stop going back. What is it going to take?" Like I want to. The other situation isn't really judging the person, it's more judging OCD. But OCD is weird. The infinitely weird ways it can show up are so funny and bizarre. Again, I would never judge a person for having the intrusive thoughts they have or doing the compulsions that are somehow linked in their mind to those obsessions, but I absolutely judge OCD and constantly marvel at how creative and weird the human brain can be. You/deleted responded. Okay, real therapist here. I got one. Some of my clients are shockingly bad at giving themselves credit, holy shit. Like they might get a nearly straight A GPA in a brutal major while battling depression, or overcome years of phobia and get behind the wheel again, or write a literal novel, or raise a kid as a single parent with low income, or build new relationships after being burned, or cope with OCD well enough to hold down a job. And they'll talk about themselves as if everyone on earth is better than them, as if their accomplishments are worthless. And I know it's because of depression or anxiety or another condition, but I'm often stunned by how differently I see them compared to how they see themselves. You/queeranarbike responded. Not a therapist, a doctor. Had a patient apologize for crying during a consultation, saying I know I shouldn't be sad, LVE got so many great things going for me. Dude. 3 months ago you had to move back to your parents after an unexpected breakup. Back to the environment which contributed to your official diagnosis. The same place where your sister was living before she died, 1 month after your return to that house, of the same diagnosis you have. And because she died during a pandemic, not only could you not visit her in hospital before she died, you had difficulty organizing her funeral. In addition to all that, he felt financially responsible for both his parents as they'd both lost their benefits, a loss which they couldn't appeal as their mental health was so poor. The concept of fighting that decision was making them suicidal. I want to hug a lot of my patients, but this one made my heart ache. You/overrated_demigod responded. There was a client, a young teenager that was hearing voices to hurt himself. He had multiple crisis calls and was admitted several times to crisis centers for observation until he got prescribed meds and was starting to show improvement. He was starting to disclose that he may have been gay and was stressed out because his father was old school religious and a pillar of the community. The young man was recommended to go to treatment start in a facility to keep him acclimate to meds and just to give him some coping skills and all that. His father pulled him out AMA and refused to allow him to continue medication. He also discontinued his therapy for a more religious approach. 3 months later he completed his suicide. I see that father around and I want to fuck him up. I wish I could. You/writer10 responded. I'm not a therapist, but was a patient after my mom passed away and needed someone to help me sort out everything I was experiencing in the wake of her death. We were discussing some major trauma. I was abandoned by both parents, as well as severe neglect abuse at the hands of caregivers. At one point, I looked up and saw my therapist had put down her notepad clipboard and was staring at me, wide-eyed. I thought she was going to diagnose me or tell me I was crazy. There was this awkward silence and she said, "You need to realize how special you are. You did it. You could have been a statistic, but you beat the odds. Do you mind if we dig back into your childhood? I want to see what you were thinking when all this was going on, because it might help me with other patients." So that was a remarkable moment for me. She told me that, not only was I normal, she found me to be exceptional. We worked together, CBT, for 8 months on my triggers and attachment issues, and put me on a path to healing. I love her, she's just an awesome person who found value in my damaged past, and in a way, allowed me to help others. You/CaptMorg77 responded. Licensed psychologist here. As many have said, judgments really aren't part of the gig if you've had good training and spent time doing the internal work on yourself as part of the process. That being said, I don't think all therapists have done that, so don't be afraid to stop seeing one of you don't think it's a good fit. I often tell clients that I see my role as being a navigator, while they are the captain. I know I've been hired on to help plot a course from where they are to their goals. While I know a lot about the waters and landscape, psychology, human behavior, habits, ECT, I count on them to be the expert on the boat and crew, themselves, their lives, important relationships. I don't expect them to take every recommendation or tool because they may know things that I don't, and I respect that. My job is to just help adjust the course as needed to avoid obstacles or deal with them when they come up. It's not my job to tell them how to live, what to do, or to judge them when they make decisions, even if those decisions are different than something we talked about. It's their boat. I almost always add though, if I end up suggesting 20 tools courses and you take none, but then come in complaining about us sailing in circles, that becomes a different conversation. Still their choice, but I'll call out concerns when I see them, with as much respect as someone does when talking to the captain. Even that conversation is without judgment though, it's just about naming a process that you see occurring and seeking to understand what's getting in the way. U/Mardukex responded. Actual therapist here, licensed clinical psychologist. Much of my work with clients specifically focuses on how not to judge our performance as employees, our value as parents or partners, and our own self-worth. Honestly, my holy shit moments have more to do with how pervasive our tendency to judge is. No matter how accomplished or resilient someone is, he has the capacity to judge themselves harshly, and often do. The funny thing is, we often judge ourselves much more harshly than others. So I'm often amazed at how blind people can be to their achievements and strengths and how unkind they can be to themselves. My role in those scenarios is to help them see themselves with compassion and to help them treat themselves as they would treat a loved one. It's a simple but not easy task, and I love every minute of it. I doubt this response is what the OP was looking to hear, but that's what comes to mind. Judgments are simple things, labels of something, a person, an idea, an object, as good or bad. They are ubiquitous in everyday life. They are painfully easy to make, and the problem lies in that we believe them. Judgment are just thoughts, and like all thoughts, they're not necessarily true. Helping people spot their judgments and either challenge or let go of them is a lifelong skill to develop. U/Ohio Gozaimesu responded. QMHPAC, soon to be LPC resident. Also, trigger warning for sexual abuse. No shade to OP, but I wish the question was, mental health professionals, MHP, what has surprised you the most about human behavior? Because most MHPs really don't judge clients for what they say, but we do have holy shit moments. I'd say for me, my holy shit moment was when I realized just how prevalent sexual abuse in childhood is and that sexual abuse is most often perpetuated by an immediate family member, e.g., parent, sibling, aunt, uncle, grandparent. So whenever I hear people say they don't believe so-and-so's story about being sexually abused by their parent, grandparent, etc. because that doesn't happen, it irks the shit out of me, to put it lightly. U/Mozzarella responded. Actual licensed therapist here. I agree with what someone else said, I really never judge my clients. You're trained to kind of switch your brain off from that kind of thinking. I think people get into this field, at least the people that should, most therapists LVE met I wouldn't send a loved one to, do so because they are very open-minded to begin with. That being said, if some of my family friends had made the choices that clients have told me about, I would totally judge them because I'm in a subjective role. As a therapist, your role is to remain as objective. This is the whole reason people go to a therapist. This doesn't mean I haven't had a lot of moments where I think holy shit this is wild, but that's different than judgment. It's such a weird awesome job. There's also a difference between judging and expressing your concern. It needs to be very delicately worded as to not make someone feel like they're being judged, because then you've lost their trust and willingness to be vulnerable with you. If you're finding yourself having trouble not judging a client and can't work your own reasons out, that's when you refer them out to someone who can be more beneficial to them. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. Leave your own stories down below, I would love to read them. If you would like to see more videos like this, please like and subscribe, it helps me out greatly.